Hello everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev and we are reading State of War, The Secret History of the CIA and the Bush Administration by James Risen. Remember, if you like what you see, what you hear, hit that like and subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you get notified when I make new videos. Without further ado, let's dig in. Chapter 4, The Hunt for WMD, which we all know as weapons of mass destruction. Dr. Sasson al-Haddad was very busy when she received the strange phone call. She was so busy and the call was so strange that she wasn't quite certain whether to follow up. It was May 2002 and the caller said he was from the CIA and that he wanted to meet with her. He didn't sound crazy, but she wasn't sure. A quiet, petite, olive-skinned woman in her 50s, Sasson wondered why a CIA officer who said he was calling from Pittsburgh would want to talk to an anesthesiologist in Cleveland. Curiosity finally got the better of her. Fear got to her too, old fears of police and security men that had receded gradually over the last 2 decades as she and her husband had built a wonderful new American life with a beautiful daughter in a plush and sprawling home in one of Cleveland's most luxurious outer suburbs. Sasson thought she had left her fears behind when she and her husband escaped from Iraq in 1979, lying to their bosses at the hospital in Baghdad about their plans for a brief vacation in London. It was before anybody in America had given much thought to Saddam Hussein, back before the United States thought much about granting Iraqi exiles political asylum from a mad dictator. Eventually, they managed to rebuild their lives and become American citizens. Sasson decided to check out the mysterious caller before agreeing to meet him. She found someone at the FBI Cleveland field office who would listen to her story. Was there such a person in Pittsburgh working for the CIA? Sasson was surprised when the FBI agent called her back. He had checked with FBI headquarters in Washington, and it turned out that the man in Pittsburgh was real and the call was genuine. The CIA really did want to talk to Dr. Sasson al-Haddad of the Cleveland Clinic, so she finally agreed to meet with Chris from Pittsburgh. As Chris was trying to contact Sasson al-Haddad, it was becoming clear that President Bush was determined to invade Iraq. In his 2002 State of the Union address the previous January, Bush had warned of an axis of evil, of which Iraq was one of only 3 members. Bush and his aides charged that Saddam Hussein was a threat to the United States because he possessed weapons of mass destruction and because his regime harbored terrorists. Saddam might use his weapons against America or give them to terrorists to do the job instead. In either case, an attack with chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons would make September 11th look like child's play. It was a risk George W. Bush said that a post 9/11 United States was not willing to take. Throughout that spring, the Bush administration had been steadily ratcheting up the rhetoric about the threat posed by terrorists, weapons of mass destruction, and Iraq. Vice President Dick Cheney went on television to say he was almost certain of more terrorist attacks on the United States, while Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced that it was only a matter of time before terrorists would get weapons of mass destruction from rogue states like Iraq. In late May, Bush spoke in Berlin where he warned that once terrorists obtained chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons from countries like Iraq, no inner voice of reason, no hint of conscience would prevent their use. With the war in Afghanistan winding down, George Bush's Washington was inexorably turning its attention toward Baghdad. Sasson told Chris that it was not possible for her to meet with him right away. Her mother had come to Cleveland from Iraq for advanced treatment for colon cancer, and Sasson had to care for her. Maybe they could talk later, she told the CIA man. In June, Sasson's mother died, and the Iraqi woman was buried in the American heartland. Soon, Sasson was ready for the CIA. The White House drumbeat on Iraq and weapons of mass destruction kept building that summer. It was filling the front pages and the airwaves by the time Chris finally sat down with Sasson at a Cleveland Starbucks in early August. The president and his lieutenants insisted that no decision about whether to invade Iraq had been made, but in a foreign policy speech at West Point in June, Bush had forcefully made the case for taking preemptive action against dictatorships such as Iraq that harbored weapons of mass destruction. Containment is not possible when unbalanced dictators with weapons of mass destruction can deliver those weapons on missiles or secretly provide them to terrorist allies, Bush told the graduating class at West Point. We cannot defend America and our friends by hoping for the best. We cannot put our faith in the word of tyrants who solemnly sign proliferation treaties and then systematically break them. If we wait for threats to fully materialize, we will have waited too long. By July, the Pentagon's plans for an invasion of Iraq had leaked to the press, and it was becoming more difficult by the day for Bush to hide his intentions. Inside the government, meanwhile, more secret documents were written to bolster the case against Iraq. On August 1st, the CIA issued a classified paper that was distributed to senior Bush administration officials. It concluded that a shipment of high-strength aluminum tubes from China to Iraq was a sign that Iraq was reviving its uranium enrichment program in order to build an atomic bomb. High-strength aluminum tubes. It's possible, but obviously was not correct. Chris stunned Sasson when he explained why he had come to talk to her. He told her that she could help in President Bush's new war on terror. She could help by going to Baghdad on a secret mission for the CIA. Chris explained that the CIA wanted Sasson, a middle-aged mother from Cleveland, to travel to Iraq and become a spy. The CIA had identified Saad Tawfiq, Sasson's brother, a British-trained electrical engineer living in Baghdad with his wife and 3 children, as a key figure in Saddam Hussein's clandestine nuclear weapons program. The CIA knew who he was, Chris told Sasson, but it didn't have any way to try to talk to him, so the CIA wanted Sasson to go to Baghdad to talk to her brother and see if he would be willing to defect through the Kurdish zone in northern Iraq. The CIA couldn't help him cross into the Kurdish zone, but if he got there on his own, the CIA would get him out to the west. If he wasn't ready to defect, the CIA wanted Salsan to ask him a series of questions about Saddam Hussein's efforts to build nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. The CIA was convinced that Saad Tawfiq knew the most sensitive secrets about Iraq's weapons program and that he might be willing to tell his sister the truth about Saddam Hussein's ambitions. Salsan found it hard to believe that the CIA didn't have some other way to get information out of Baghdad, but after thinking hard about it, she decided she was willing to do her part. She had not seen her brother since 1989 on a brief and nervous visit to pre-Gulf War Iraq, but she thought he might want to help. She told Chris she was willing to try. Salsan was volunteering for a late, desperate Hail Mary pass by the CIA. As President Bush and other administration officials were turning up the rhetoric heat on Iraq, key leaders within the CIA faced an uncomfortable fact. The United States did not have the proof to back up what the president was saying publicly about Iraq and its weapons of mass destruction. Worse, the CIA had been operating virtually in the blind about Iraq for years. Its evidence was either old and obsolete, or from second-hand, third-hand, or fourth-hand sources, defectors and exiles who had their own political agendas. Almost every analyst at the CIA assumed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, but they did not have hard evidence to back that up. What was worse, many of them knew it. In 1988, the United Nations had withdrawn its weapons inspectors from Iraq after a showdown with Saddam Hussein over access to key sites in the country. President Bill Clinton launched a 4-day bombing campaign to punish Iraq for its refusal to cooperate with the UN inspectors. But the bombs had no real effect. The withdrawal of the inspectors severely hampered the CIA's ability to keep track of Iraqi weapons efforts in the years before the 2003 war. Throughout the 1990s, the CIA had relied almost entirely on the UN inspectors for intelligence about Iraq's weapons programs. After their withdrawal, the CIA failed to develop reliable sources of its own inside Iraq. Let me try that sentence again. After their withdrawal, the CIA failed to develop reliable sources of its own inside Iraq to report on Baghdad's weapons programs. I knew I could do it if I just put my mind to it. In the year before the 2003 war, the CIA had only one case officer spying from inside Baghdad. He was posing undercover as a diplomat working in the embassy of another country. But that case officer did not develop or recruit any sources who knew the status of Iraq's weapon program. The agency had also developed sources within the Iraqi military, largely through the Iraqi National Accord, an exile group led by Ayad Alawi, a CIA asset who later became the interim Prime Minister of Iraq. But none of those military officers had any first-hand knowledge about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. By mid-2002, most of the agency's information was at least 4 years out of date. Charlie Allen, the CIA's assistant director for collection and a legendary figure within the agency, was the highest-ranking CIA official willing to try to do something about the problem. Allen had carved a unique niche for himself within the U.S. intelligence community. He looked for collection gaps, intelligence targets that were not being adequately covered by the CIA and other intelligence agencies. He realized that Iraqi weapons of mass destruction represented an enormous intelligence gap. while other top CIA officials, including CIA Director George Tenet and Deputy Director for Operations James Pavitt, dithered and failed to mount any serious operations to get more spies into Iraq to find out what was going on, Allen, an old hand who had little time for Tenet and the circle of yes men and yes women on Tenet's senior staff, began a renegade effort to search for new sources of information. He pushed for several new collections programs, including one that called for approaching members of the families of Iraqi scientists who were believed to be involved in secret weapons programs. At the time, the CIA had no direct access to key Iraqi scientists, and so using family members as intermediaries to find out what the scientists were doing seemed like the next best thing. Most of the key scientists who had been involved in the weapons programs in the past had been interviewed repeatedly by UN inspectors during the 1990s. During those earlier interviews, they had all insisted that the weapons programs had been abandoned. But the United States was convinced that the scientists had been lying, since they were always closely watched by Iraqi security during the interviews. At least thanks to the UN's inspections, the CIA had a fairly comprehensive list of Iraq's senior weapons scientists. Charlie Allen realized that list gave him something to go on. Allen's collection team began contacting family members living outside of Iraq, asking them whether they would be willing to help the agency by going back to Iraq to talk to their relatives about their scientific work. I'm sure that doesn't look suspicious at all, right? Oh, sister, I haven't seen you in 10 years. Oh, yeah, of course you can stay with me. You're asking me about my weapons? No, that's not suspicious. Where am I? At least 30 relatives of Iraqi scientists agreed to cooperate, including Sassan al-Haddad. The CIA was eager to get her on board. Saad Tawfiq had long since been identified as one of the senior figures in the Iraqi nuclear program. He was a Shia Muslim, never completely trusted by the Sunni-dominated regime of Saddam Hussein. Yet Saad was one of the true technical experts that Iraq couldn't do without. The CIA had initially contacted his younger brother, who was living in Houston. After he rebuffed them, Charlie Allen's team approached Sassan in Cleveland. Throughout August 2002, Chris became a regular in Cleveland, meeting Sassan at restaurants and at her home in suburban Moreland Hills, finally bringing a CIA technician along to train Sassan in the rudiments of espionage. The agency had put together a long list of questions she was to ask her brother, but Sassan couldn't just walk into Baghdad carrying a memo from the CIA, so the technician tried to teach her the art of secret writing, showed her how to read and write using invisible ink on fast-burning paper. Sassan was a practical woman, and she realized that the CIA's techniques were too cumbersome and dangerous if done incorrectly in the heart of Iraq. She finally told Chris she would skip the secret communications and would memorize the questions instead. Privately, she decided to use her favorite crossword puzzles to guide her. She wrote mnemonic aids into crossword puzzles that she could take with her on the plane to Iraq. Keywords to remind her of the questions she was supposed to ask. Before sending Sassan, the CIA wanted to make certain that her brother would be willing to talk to her once she got there. Sassan offered the perfect intermediary to get word to him. Her mother-in-law was visiting Cleveland from Baghdad and was due to return home in early September. She could tell Saad that the CIA wanted to talk to him through Sasan and could ask him if he would do it. Frightened but willing, the mother-in-law agreed, returned home to Baghdad, and found a moment to talk to Saad on the street outside his home, away from the listening devices that were almost certainly planted inside. "They want to talk to you, and they will send Sasan," the old woman told Saad Tawfiq. "Sasan will call you tonight and ask how you are feeling. If you are willing, tell her that you are okay." You like how I lean forward when it's kind of supposed to be a secret thing? Sasan called her brother, asked him how he was feeling, and he said that he was okay. She repeated the question 3 times to make certain that she had heard him right. Sasan left for Baghdad a few days later, explaining to Iraqi authorities that her mother had just died and that she needed to settle her estate. Since she was now carrying an American passport with her married name, which was different from the family name on her old Iraqi passport, it didn't register with the Iraqis that this was the same woman who had escaped so many years before. I sense this going south. It was early September. The Bush administration was now raising the stakes on Iraq, warning that Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program posed an immediate threat to the United States, and the White House was strongly suggesting that war could not be delayed. On September 8th, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice coined a memorably ominous phrase on a Sunday talk show when she said, "While there will always be some uncertainty about how quickly Saddam Hussein can acquire nuclear weapons, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud." Just as Rice was making the public case against Iraq, the Defense Intelligence Agency issued a classified report entitled Iraq's Re-Emerging Nuclear Weapons Program, which concluded that Baghdad was on its way to building the bomb. Vice President Cheney, sounding impatient with any further debate, went on a Sunday talk show to add that this problem Iraq has to be dealt with one way or another. To ratchet up the pressure, the Bush administration leaked information to the American press. The New York Times published a story on September 8th, the same day Rice issued her mushroom cloud warning, making public the evidence that Iraq had acquired aluminum tubes to rebuild the nuclear weapons program. The story stated that more than a decade after Saddam Hussein agreed to give up weapons of mass destruction, Iraq has stepped up its quest for nuclear weapons and has embarked on a worldwide hunt for materials to make an atomic bomb, Bush administration officials said today. Because he got aluminum tubes. When Sasan stepped off the plane at Saddam International Airport in Baghdad, she didn't even recognize her brother. When they finally spotted each other, it was a joyous reunion. Saad had a friend in the Iraqi security services, and he helped Sasan sail through the Iraqi customs and immigration bureaucracy. On the ride into town, Sasan could also barely recognize the city of her youth. Baghdad had changed so dramatically. She was surprised to see that so many women were now covered. Baghdad didn't seem as secular and open as it once did. They returned to Saad's house. It had been their parents' home in the old days. in the affluent Mansour neighborhood of Baghdad, located right next door to the headquarters of the Mukhabarat, the Iraqi intelligence service. Sasan was depressed to see that years of war and privation had led to the steady deterioration of their family home. It had been damaged repeatedly in U.S. bombing raids targeting the neighboring Mukhabarat building, both in the first Gulf War in 1991 and in a raid in 1993 to punish the Iraqis for trying to kill the first President Bush. She spent her first day catching up with family and old neighborhood friends, then waited until late the second night of her visit to speak privately with her brother. Until that night, she had never really had a candid conversation with her brother about his work in Iraq. She had seen him only twice in 25 years. He had been allowed to come to the United States once in 1983 for a professional conference, and she had returned once to Iraq in 1989 for a medical convention. On that visit, Sasan had noticed that her mother was unhappy and worried that her son was involved in work that might get him hurt. But Saad had refused to talk about it. They had tried to keep in touch since, but it had been difficult, and so her brother's life was something of a mystery to her. Saad Tawfiq's entire career on the inside of one of the most ruthless regimes in modern history. His life as a key member of the most secretive scientific team in the world, the team that tried to build a nuclear bomb for Saddam Hussein, had hinged on one moment, a moment when he was forced to choose between freedom and family responsibility. He was raised a son of privilege and standing in old Iraq, an Iraq in which family and education meant something, before it was twisted and corrupted by Saddam Hussein. Born in 1951, Saad was the son of a doctor and spent much of his youth in the southern Iraqi city of Basra until he was sent away to boarding school in Baghdad. There he attended the finest prep school Iraq had to offer, Baghdad College, run by American Jesuit priests from Boston College. In college, Saad first met many of the boys who would later run Iraq. The American Jesuit teachers instilled in Saad Tawfiq a hunger for learning. He also learned to play baseball and basketball and gained a glimpse at the wider world of possibilities beyond his Arab homeland. It didn't matter to him that he was a Muslim Shia attending a Catholic school. From Baghdad College, Saad went to Baghdad University to study engineering, and his academic prowess landed him a graduate fellowship at the University of Sussex in Britain. Throughout the late 1970s, he worked on his doctorate at Sussex and lived in Brighton with his Iraqi wife and growing family. It was an idyllic time when all things seemed possible. His PhD thesis in electrical engineering and his specialty of systems and control dealt with optimizing the control of harbor cranes for rapid ship unloading, a supremely practical issue that allowed him to dream of transforming his hometown, the harbor of Basra, into a world-class port. Saad completed his thesis and received his doctorate in August 1980. He had been in Britain for 4 years, and Iraq increasingly seemed like part of his past. He was quickly offered 2 different jobs by Western firms doing business in the Middle East and accepted one from a British firm handling the construction and air conditioning of tunnels in Saudi Arabia that were to be used by Muslim pilgrims on the path of the Hajj to Mecca. pretty interesting. In January 1981, he was all set to move to Liverpool and start his new career when he received word that his father had died in Baghdad. 4 months earlier, Iraq had invaded revolutionary Iran. The brutal war between the two neighbors was already chewing up the Iraqi army and giving Saddam Hussein an enormous appetite for fresh troops. Even though Saad was now a 30-year-old scientist with a wife and a child, a return trip to Iraq now meant an almost certain ticket into the army. But Saad was the oldest son, and his mother was now alone. His 2 sisters and his youngest brother had all escaped to the United States. For Saad, there really was no choice. He had to return. He knew it meant the end of his dreams of a life beyond Iraq. As soon as he returned, Saad was dispatched into the army. But before long, and it's funny because now he can't take care of his mom, and he knew it was going to happen. Whatever. As soon as he returned, Saad was dispatched into the army, but before long, a friend told him of a unique job opportunity, one that could gain him an exemption from further military service. The Iraqi Atomic Energy Commission was looking for a new scientist. There was an added Philip? There was an added Philip with an F, a free parcel of land courtesy of Saddam Hussein. It must be an Iraqi word. By mid-1981, Saddam Hussein had already become desperate to find new weapons that could break the grim calculus of war with Iran, and he was enamored of the terrible possibilities offered by weapons of mass destruction. The centerpiece of his efforts was a French-designed nuclear reactor then under construction in Tuwaitha, just south of Baghdad. The reactor was part of a bigger complex that included a second, smaller French reactor and a Soviet-made test reactor that was already in use. Once the plan was completed with the help of French engineers, Saddam Hussein hoped the reactor would bring him one step closer to turning Iraq into a nuclear power. Although the French had not provided Iraq with the technology to use the reactor to reprocess weapons-grade fuel, that was clearly Saddam Hussein's ultimate objective. Saad Tawfiq was told nothing about a weapons program when he was hired. Instead, he was assigned to a series of scientific research projects, none of which had anything to do with bomb making. Yet on June 7th, 1981, the day before Saad Tawfiq was due to start work, the Israeli Air Force bombed the Tuwaitha plant in a stunning and high-risk raid by F-15 and F-16 fighters. The French reactor, known to the outside world as Osirek, but called Tammuz-1 by the Iraqis, was destroyed. The Israeli government of Prime Minister Menachem Begin announced that it had conducted the raid in order to block Saddam Hussein from obtaining an atomic bomb with which he could destroy Israel. Paradoxically, it was the Israeli strike on Tuwaitha that led Saad Tawfiq into the clandestine world of nuclear weapons development. As Saad and others dug through the rubble at Tuwaitha, trying to salvage whatever equipment they could, Saddam Hussein began searching for a new path to nuclear weapons. Finally, a scientist under house arrest offered the regime a solution. Ja'far Dia Jafar, a Shia who had fallen out of favor with Saddam, said that he knew of a way to develop a bomb without a large reactor. He said Iraq could follow the original path of the American Manhattan Project, which built one of its first bombs using a technique that was later abandoned because it was so slow and tedious. and required enormous amounts of electricity. But those problems were offset by two advantages. The old Manhattan Project technique would be hard for the outside world to detect, and better still, much of the Manhattan Project's technology was now in the public domain and would be relatively easy for Iraq to duplicate. Jafar was describing a uranium enrichment process known as EMIS, electromagnetic isotope separation, which calls for the use of large magnets to help separate ions of two different uranium isotopes. EMIS can produce weapons-grade material in a relatively straightforward manner, and it can do so without the use of a modern nuclear reactor. Of course, EMIS still wouldn't be easy for a small country like Iraq. The Americans had 11 Nobel laureates to do EMIS during the Manhattan Project. We had none, recalled Dafur Rashid Selby, who was a top manager in the Iraqi program working for Jafar. But EMIS was such a slow, labor and energy-intensive process that every other nuclear power in the world had abandoned it. No one in the West would ever guess that Iraq was now secretly using it. Jafar's proposal was adopted and he was released from house arrest in order to create a new EMIS program. One of the first people he tapped to join his new team was Saad Tawfiq. Before long, Saad would become one of Jafar's proteges. He followed his lead throughout the rest of his career and eventually became one of his senior managers. The nuclear program was given a cover name, Petrochemical 3, to convince outsiders that the team was involved in oil-related work. No one, not even Jafar, ever came to Saad and told him he was now assigned to work on a nuclear bomb. Even within the team, there were no explicit orders announcing the bomb program. The team just came together and began working, with subgroups assigned to very specific tasks. Left unsaid was the fact that the only end result that could come from the combination of all of the specific tasks of all of the various subgroups was the creation of an atomic weapon. It was unspoken. No one ever said it was a weapons program, recalls Saad. We would talk about the subsystems we were working on, about magnets, power supply, but we wouldn't talk about the overall program, even though it was obvious to everyone. We would sometimes talk about it amongst ourselves, but we couldn't talk openly. Saad never even told his wife any details about his work. At the time, Saad didn't even have any qualms about trying to help Iraq build the bomb. He believed that it would help create an equilibrium with Israel, he recalled. And I didn't think Saddam was a madman. Tune into the next episode and we'll finish that up, see how it goes. Thanks for joining me. Hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.